The sinking of the Titanic is one of the most famous and tragic stories of all time. But how she met her fate was not just the result of a collision between a liner and an iceberg.
From the very day that she was designed, she was almost doomed.
Astonishing new scientific evidence reveals the chain of events that brought about the demise of a ship that was thought to be unsinkable and led to the death of over 1,500 people, the greatest maritime loss in modern history.
There was a lot of questions surrounding what role the materials played in the sinking of the ship.
For the first time, scientists believe they have uncovered the last piece of the puzzle that has baffled experts for almost half a century. A mystery that involves a fateful combination of design flaws and poor choice of shipbuilding materials that set the Titanic on a collision course with death and destiny. April 14th, 1912. In the dead of night on a flat, calm sea, an extraordinary event is taking place. An iceberg with a mass of 500,000 tons drifts into the path of the Titanic.
Iceberg, right ahead.
Hard a starboard!
They have seconds to react.
Come on.
At 11:39 p.m., Titanic scrapes the iceberg. Officers believe they have avoided disaster. But below the waterline, it is another story. News about the number of lives lost breaks one day after the disaster. Among the dead are some of the most wealthy and influential celebrities of the day, as well as hundreds of poor immigrants dreaming of a new life in America. Grieving relatives of the victims in Britain and the US are stunned and desperate to know how the impossible could have happened. The Titanic was designed to be the most luxurious and also the safest ship ever built. Even if rammed by another ship, she was designed to stay afloat. Yet she took only 2 hours to sink after colliding with an iceberg. Now, almost 100 years later, some questions still remain unanswered. Who or what was responsible? And why did the mightiest ship of her time sink so quickly? Forensic metallurgist Jennifer Hooper McCarty is piecing together the events that took place on that fateful journey. She is re-examining forensic evidence recovered from the wreck, along with survivor testimony and archive records from 1912.
We have very little knowledge of what that impact was like. What we do know is only based on the survivor testimony from 1912.
2 weeks after the sinking of the Titanic, a British public inquiry is held. A panel of judges will decide who was to blame for the disaster and loss of over 1,500 lives. The key witness is Bruce Ismay, the 50-year-old chairman of White Star, the owner of Titanic. He is one of the few men who survived the maiden voyage. Wireless operator Harold Bride and Second Officer Charles Lighthaller also testify. These three men's testimony are vital in deciding who was to blame.
Oh, Mr. Isley.
I gather that you yourself gave the instructions for the building of the Titanic.
Yes.
And of course you considered the question of floatability of the ship in cases of accident or emergency.
We did.
Did you give any special consideration to the question of providing additional lifeboat accommodation?
I think the position was taken that the ship was looked upon as being practically unsinkable. She was looked upon as a lifeboat herself.
Two years before the scheduled launch date, Ismay met with his chief designer, Alexander Carlyle.
Much longer entrance into the room here if we can. The staircase needs to be much grander.
Well, the bulkhead will have to be lowered.
Is there a problem? Isn't she safe?
Of course. Excuse me.
The bulkheads are partitions used to create watertight compartments in the hull of the ship, each of which could be isolated and sealed off to contain flooding in the event of an emergency. The higher the bulkheads, the safer the ship, as it would be more likely that water could be contained within any damaged compartments.
Each of the 16 compartments is watertight. In the event of a leak, each compartment can be sealed up by an electric-powered door operated from the bridge. Even if 4 compartments flood, she'll stay afloat.
Good. Let's lower the bulkheads then.
The height of the watertight compartments will be lowered to just 3 meters above the waterline.
The boat deck should not be so cluttered.
Cluttered?
Yes, cluttered. People don't pay to look at lifeboats.
Well, I thought 48 to be a reasonable amount, especially if the Board of Trade increased the requirements.
Well, let's not second-guess the British Board of Trade, shall we? Let's move on to the Grand Salon.
And this meeting with Mr. Ismay lasted 4 hours.
Yes, we talked about the whole of the decorations of the ship.
Never mind the decorations, we're talking about lifeboats.
Well, the lifeboat part, I suppose, took about 5 or 10 minutes.
How many lifeboats did you think there ought to be?
I thought there ought to be 3 on each set of davits.
And how many would that make altogether?
48 boats.
You thought there ought to be 48.
Yes.
Whereas in point of fact, how many were there?
16.
16.